The merciless Texas sun beat down on the livestock market, turning the red dust into a suffocating cloud that clung to everything it touched. The year was 1887, and the town of Redemption Creek was buzzing with its monthly cattle auction. Cowboys, ranchers, and traders crowded the wooden pens, their voices mixing with the bellowing of cattle and whinnying of horses. Jonathan Hale stood apart from the chaos, his weathered face shaded by a worn Stetson. At 35, he cut a solitary figure, tall, lean, with shoulders that spoke of years breaking horses and mending fences. His gray eyes, the color of a coming storm, surveyed the livestock with the practiced ease of a man who knew quality when he saw it. The old war wound in his left shoulder ached, as it always did when the weather was about to turn, but he ignored it. Pain was an old companion, one he'd learned to live with since his days fighting in the Indian Wars. He'd come for a new mare. His old girl, Duchess, had finally given in to age the previous winter, and the ranch work demanded a reliable mount. But as he made his way through the maze of pens and makeshift stalls, something else caught his attention. Near the far end of the market, where the less reputable traders conducted their business, a small crowd had gathered. Not the excited clustering of men around prize stock, but something different, something that made the hair on the back of Jonathan's neck stand up. "She's strong enough for household work," a gravelly voice was saying. "Don't let her appearance fool you. She can cook, clean, tend to animals, just can't hear nothing, and don't speak a word. Perfect for a man who values his peace and quiet." Jonathan pushed through the crowd, his curiosity overcoming his natural inclination to mind his own business. In the center of the gathering stood Samuel McKenna, a trader known for dealing in everything from stolen horses to contraband whiskey. And beside him, with a rope around her wrists like she was no different from the cattle in the nearby pens, stood a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 19, though the dust and grime made it hard to tell. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that might have been pretty if not for the bruises shadowing her left cheek. But it was her eyes that stopped Jonathan cold, deep brown, like coffee beans, and burning with a fierce intelligence that contradicted everything McKenna was saying about her. The girl's name is Clara Rose," McKenna continued, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Her own daddy brought her to me. Said she's been nothing but trouble since her mama died. Can't contribute to the family. What with being deaf and mute and all. Figured someone might have use for her, even if she is damaged goods." The crowd murmured, some men stepping forward for a closer look. Clara Rose, if that was truly her name, kept her gaze fixed on the ground. But Jonathan noticed the way her fingers clenched and unclenched against the rope binding her wrists. "How much?" The question came from Benjamin Crawford, a rancher from the valley known for working his help into the ground. $50, McKenna replied. "Same as a decent pack mule, which is about what she's worth." Jonathan felt his jaw tighten. The casualness of it all, discussing a human being like livestock, made his stomach turn. He'd seen enough cruelty in his life, had participated in his share during the wars, and had sworn to himself he'd have no more part in it. He was about to turn away when Clara Rose lifted her head. For just a moment, their eyes met across the crowd. In that brief connection, Jonathan saw something that shook him to his core. Not plea for help, not desperation, but a quiet strength that reminded him of wild horses he'd seen in the mountains, unbroken, despite everything. "I'll take her." The words were out before Jonathan could stop them. The crowd turned to look at him, and McKenna's face split into a yellow-toothed grin. "Well now, Jonathan Hale, didn't figure you for the type to need companionship. What with that ranch of yours way out in the Badlands?" "The price," Jonathan said curtly. $50. You said—" "That's right. Cash on the barrel?" Jonathan reached into his vest pocket, pulling out the roll of bills he'd brought for the mare. It was nearly all the ready cash he had, meant to last him through the winter, but something about the girl's eyes wouldn't let him walk away. He counted out the bills, each one feeling heavier than the last. McKenna snatched them up, counting them again with greedy fingers. "She's all yours," the trader said, pushing Clara Rose forward so roughly she stumbled. "No returns. Though, you break her, you keep her." The crowd began to disperse, some men laughing and shaking their heads at Jonathan's foolishness. Benjamin Crawford clapped him on the shoulder as he passed. "Hope she's worth it. Hail. Though I can't imagine what use you'll have for a deaf-mute girl on that godforsaken ranch of yours." Jonathan ignored him, focusing instead on the young woman who now stood before him, her eyes downcast once more. He pulled out his knife, and she flinched slightly, but he merely cut through the rope binding her wrists. "Can you walk?" he asked, then felt foolish. If she was truly deaf, she wouldn't hear him. But Clara Rose looked up at him, those coffee-brown eyes studying his face intently. After a moment, she nodded. "Good," Jonathan muttered, more to himself than to her. "Let's get out of here." He turned and started walking toward where he'd left his wagon, not looking back to see if she followed, but he could sense her presence behind him, moving with surprisingly quiet steps for someone who supposedly couldn't hear. The wagon sat on the outskirts of the market, his two horses Thunder and Lightning, waiting patiently in the shade of a scraggly mesquite tree. Jonathan checked their water, trying to figure out what in blazes he was going to do now. He'd come for a horse and was leaving with a human being, a young woman who couldn't speak or hear, if McKenna was to be believed. He turned to find Clara Rose standing a few feet away, watching him with those unsettling eyes. In the better light, away from the crowd, he could see she was indeed pretty beneath the dirt and bruises. Her dress, once blue, was faded and patched in multiple places. Her feet were bare, and Jonathan noticed the cuts and calluses that spoke of long walks on hard ground. "Look," he said, then stopped. How did one communicate with someone who couldn't hear he'd learned some of the sign language used by the Plains Indians during his army days? But he doubted this girl would know it. Instead, he pointed to the wagon bed, then to her, then made a sitting motion. Clara Rose understood immediately. Climbing up with more grace than he'd expected, she settled herself among the supplies, pulling her knees to her chest in a defensive posture that made her look even younger. Jonathan rubbed his face, feeling every one of his 35 years. What was he thinking? He had no business taking responsibility for another person. His ranch was no place for a young woman, isolated, hard, demanding work from dawn to dusk. And that was assuming she even could work, assuming McKenna hadn't lied about that like traders lied about everything else. But it was done now. He'd paid the money, and his pride wouldn't let him go back and admit he'd made a mistake. Besides, something about the girl intrigued him. The intelligence in her eyes didn't match the story of a helpless deaf-mute. He climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. "It's a long ride," he said over his shoulder, knowing she couldn't hear but feeling the need to fill the silence. "Best get comfortable." As they pulled away from Redemption Creek, Jonathan caught sight of their reflection in a store window, a lone cowboy and a mysterious girl, heading out into the vast Texas wilderness. He didn't know it then, but that image would burn itself into his memory, marking the moment when everything in his carefully ordered life began to change. The road stretched out before them, dusty and rutted, winding its way toward the Badlands where Jonathan had built his ranch. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and promising trouble. Behind him, Clara Rose shifted slightly, and he could have sworn he heard her humming, just barely, under her breath, a melody he didn't recognize. But that was impossible. Deaf people didn't hum. Did they? As Thunder and Lightning pulled them steadily away from town and toward the uncertain future, Jonathan Hale began to suspect that nothing about Clara Rose was quite what it seemed. And for the first time in years, despite all his better judgment, he found himself curious about what tomorrow might bring. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they rolled along the dusty trail leading away from Redemption Creek. Jonathan kept his eyes on the horizon, where the storm clouds he'd noticed earlier were building into something more substantial. The air had taken on that heavy, electric quality that preceded a serious blow. Behind him, Clara Rose remained silent, though he could feel her presence like a weight between his shoulder blades. Every now and then, he'd glance back to make sure she hadn't jumped off the wagon and run. Each time, he found her in the same position, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, those dark eyes taking in everything around her with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. They'd been traveling for nearly 2 hours when Thunder began to act up, tossing his head and snorting. Lightning picked up on his partner's nervousness, and soon both horses were fighting the reins. "Whoa, easy, boys," Jonathan murmured, but his own instincts were beginning to prickle. The air had gone still, too still, and the sky to the northwest had taken on an ominous yellow-brown tinge. Sandstorm. He'd seen enough of them to know the signs. This one was coming fast and looked to be a bad one. They needed shelter, and they needed it now. But they were in open country, miles from any town or way station. Jonathan scanned the landscape desperately. To the east, he could make out a line of low hills, possibly limestone outcroppings that might offer some protection, but they were at least a mile away, and the storm was moving faster than his loaded wagon could travel. He was calculating their chances when he felt a sharp tug on his sleeve. Whirling around, he found Clara Rose had moved forward, her face urgent. She was pointing insistently toward the southwest, the opposite direction from where he'd been looking. "There's nothing that way," he said automatically, then cursed himself for forgetting she couldn't hear. But Clara Rose continued pointing, her gestures becoming more emphatic. She made a shape with her hands, 2 fingers walking, then diving down. A ravine. Jonathan squinted in the direction she was indicating. He couldn't see anything but scrub brush and red dirt, but the girl's certainty was compelling. She tugged at his sleeve again, and this time, when he looked at her, she placed her hand flat against her chest, right over her heart, then pointed again. "Trust me," the gesture seemed to say. The wind was picking up now, sending small dust devils spinning across their path. In minutes, they'd be engulfed. Against every instinct that told him to head for the visible shelter of the hills, Jonathan turned the wagon southwest. "This better be right," he muttered, snapping the reins to urge the horses into a faster pace. Clara Rose had climbed onto the seat beside him now, one hand gripping the side rail, the other still pointing. Her hair whipped around her face in the rising wind, but her expression was focused, determined. They'd gone maybe a 1/4 mile when Jonathan saw it, a dark line in the earth that revealed itself to be a narrow canyon, carved by some long dry river. It was nearly invisible until you were right on top of it, hidden by the way the land folded in on itself. Without hesitation, he guided the horses down the steep path that led into the canyon. The walls rose up on either side, providing immediate relief from the wind. About 50 feet in, the canyon widened into a natural chamber, complete with an overhang that would protect them from the worst of the storm. Jonathan brought the wagon to a halt and jumped down, working quickly to unhitch Thunder and Lightning. The horses were wild-eyed with fear, but they calmed somewhat once they were in the shelter of the overhang. He secured them firmly, then turned his attention to covering the wagon's contents with the tarp he always carried. Clara Rose had climbed down as well and was already gathering the loose items that might blow away, moving with an efficiency that surprised him. Together, they worked in silence as the world above them turned into a howling brown hell. The storm hit in earnest just as they finished securing everything. The wind screamed overhead, and dust filtered down into their shelter despite the protection of the canyon walls. Jonathan pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, then noticed Clara Rose had nothing to protect herself with. Without thinking, he pulled off his coat and draped it over her head and shoulders, creating a makeshift tent. She looked up at him, startled, and for a moment they were very close. Close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Then the full fury of the storm was upon them, and there was nothing to do but huddle against the canyon wall and wait. The sandstorm raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Jonathan kept Clara Rose close, shielding her smaller body with his own as much as possible. She didn't resist, though he could feel the tension in her, like a wild animal allowing itself to be helped but ready to bolt at the first opportunity. When the wind finally began to die down, they were both covered in a fine layer of red dust. Jonathan stepped back, suddenly aware of how improper their position had been. Clara Rose seemed to sense his discomfort and moved away as well, shaking the dust from his coat before trying to hand it back to him. "Keep it for now," he said, gesturing for her to put it on properly. The evening would be cold after the storm, and her thin dress offered little protection. As he checked on the horses and surveyed the damage to their supplies, minimal, thanks to their preparation, Jonathan found himself stealing glances at the young woman. How had she known about this canyon? It wasn't marked on any map, and even he, who'd traveled this road dozens of times, had never noticed it. Clara Rose had found a relatively clean spot to sit and was carefully cleaning the dust from her face with a corner of his coat. In the fading light that filtered into the canyon, she looked even younger than before, and Jonathan felt a fresh wave of doubt about what he'd done. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced, though he knew she couldn't hear him. The habit of speaking aloud was too strong to break. No point trying to travel in the dark after that storm. He set about making a simple camp, gathering dried brush for a fire, unpacking bedrolls and food supplies. Clara Rose watched for a moment, then began helping without being asked. She seemed to anticipate what he needed, handing him items before he reached for them. As they worked together to prepare a simple meal of beans and hardtack, Jonathan found himself studying her more closely. Her movements were graceful but purposeful, and she handled the camp equipment with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't her first time roughing it. When she thought he wasn't looking, she would touch various objects, the canyon wall, the wagon wheel, even the ground with her fingertips, as if feeling for something. After they'd eaten, sitting on opposite sides of the small fire, Jonathan made another attempt at communication. He pointed to himself and said clearly, "Jonathan?" Then he pointed at her and raised his eyebrows in question. She tilted her head, studying his face in that intense way she had. Then, to his surprise, she pointed to herself and mouthed silently but clearly, "Clara." "So you can read lips," he said, speaking slowly and making sure she could see his face in the firelight. "That's something, at least." Clara nodded, then made a gesture he didn't understand, touching her ears, then her throat, then shaking her head. "You can't hear or speak," he interpreted, and she nodded again. But then she did something unexpected. She placed her hand flat on the ground beside her and closed her eyes. After a moment, she pointed up toward where the horses were tethered, then held up 2 fingers. Jonathan frowned, not understanding. Then thunder shifted his weight, his hoof striking stone, and lightning responded with a soft nicker. 2 horses moving. "You felt that?" he asked, incredulous. "Through the ground." Clara opened her eyes and gave him a small smile, the first he'd seen from her. She touched her ears again, then placed both hands on the ground, and finally pointed to her chest. "I hear differently," the gestures seemed to say, as the fire burned down to embers and the desert night grew cold around them. Jonathan found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about the young woman he'd purchased like livestock. She wasn't helpless or damaged. As McKenna had claimed, she was something else, something he didn't quite understand yet. He gave her his bedroll, insisting with gestures when she tried to refuse. He'd slept on harder ground with less cover during his army days, as he settled himself against the canyon wall with just a saddle blanket. He watched her carefully arrange the bedding, her movements speaking of a deep exhaustion she'd been hiding all day. Just before she lay down, Clara Rose did something that would haunt his dreams that night. She looked directly at him, placed her hand over her heart, and then extended it toward him, a simple gesture of gratitude that somehow carried more weight than any words could have. As the stars wheeled overhead and the desert returned to its nocturnal life, Jonathan Hale lay awake, listening to the soft breathing of the mysterious young woman who had somehow, in the space of a single day, begun to crack the walls he'd built around himself. Tomorrow, they would reach his ranch. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out what to do with her, how to fit her into his solitary life. But tonight, in this hidden canyon she had led them to, with the storm's aftermath still settling around them, he allowed himself to wonder if perhaps fate had played a hand in bringing them together. The last thought that crossed his mind before sleep finally claimed him was of her eyes in the firelight, and how they'd seemed to see straight through to parts of himself he'd thought long dead. The Double H Ranch sat in a valley between two ridges, a modest spread of adobe buildings and wooden corrals that Jonathan had built with his own hands over the past 5 years. As the wagon crested the final hill and home came into view, he felt the familiar mixture of pride and loneliness that always accompanied his return. Clara Rose straightened beside him, taking in the sight of her new home. The main house was small but solid, with a covered porch that faced east to catch the morning sun. The barn stood off to one side, along with a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and various other outbuildings. It wasn't much, but it was his. "Welcome to the Double H," Jonathan said, gesturing broadly even though he knew she was reading his lips more than hearing his words. "It's not fancy, but it keeps the weather out." Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed everything. When her gaze landed on the small corral where his remaining horses milled about, something in her face softened. As soon as the wagon rolled to a stop, she climbed down and walked directly to the corral fence. The horses, a bay mare named Liberty, an aging paint called Washington, and a young stallion Jonathan had named Grant, all lifted their heads at her approach. To Jonathan's amazement, Liberty walked right over to the fence, ears pricked forward with interest rather than the wariness she usually showed strangers. Clara Rose extended her hand slowly, letting the mare sniff her fingers. Then she did something extraordinary. She placed her palm flat against Liberty's neck and closed her eyes, standing perfectly still for a long moment. When she opened them again, she turned to Jonathan with concern written across her face. She pointed to the horse's right foreleg and made a gesture he interpreted as hurt. Her leg. Jonathan frowned. "She was fine when I left 3 days ago." But when he climbed into the corral to check, sure enough, he found heat and swelling in Liberty's right foreleg. It was subtle. He might not have noticed for another day or two, but it was definitely there. "I'll be damned," he muttered, then glanced at Clara apologetically. "Sorry, how did you know?" Clara Rose was already moving, heading for the barn with purpose. Jonathan followed, curious, and found her examining his meager collection of veterinary supplies. She selected several items: liniment, bandages, a tin of salve, then pointed toward the water pump. Over the next hour, Jonathan watched in growing amazement as Clara Rose treated Liberty's leg with a competence that spoke of long experience. She prepared a poultice from plants she found growing along the fence line, mixing them with a salve to create something that smelled sharp but not unpleasant. Her hands were gentle but sure as she applied the treatment and wrapped the leg. "Where did you learn this?" Jonathan asked, making sure she could see his face. "Who taught you?" Clara Rose finished tying off the bandage before responding. She pointed to herself, then made a cradling motion with her arms. "A baby." Then she pointed to the horses and made a gesture that encompassed the land around them. She'd grown up around horses. He understood. Been caring for them since she was small. That evening, as Jonathan showed her around the house and tried to figure out sleeping arrangements, he found himself constantly surprised. Clara Rose didn't act like someone who'd been sold by her own father. She moved through the space with quiet dignity, taking note of everything but touching little. When he showed her the small room off the kitchen that he used for storage, thinking he could clear it out for her. She shook her head and pointed to the barn. "You want to sleep in the barn?" he asked, incredulous. She nodded firmly, and something in her expression told him not to argue. Perhaps she felt safer there, with the animals. Or perhaps she simply wasn't ready to trust him enough to sleep under the same roof. Over the following days, a routine developed. Clara Rose would rise before dawn. Jonathan knew because he could see the lantern light in the barn, and begin her day by tending to the animals. She had a way with them that he'd never seen before. The chickens, which usually scattered when he approached, would gather around her feet. The barn cats, half-wild things that barely tolerated humans, would curl up in her lap while she worked. But it was with the horses that her gift truly showed. Within a week, she had identified and begun treating minor ailments in all of them that Jonathan hadn't even known existed. Washington's stiff gait improved after she spent hours massaging his legs with some concoction she'd made. Grant, who'd been head shy since Jonathan bought him, began allowing Clara Rose to handle his face and ears. She couldn't speak, but she communicated constantly, with gestures, expressions, and an elaborate system of signs she seemed to be developing just for them. She made herself understood. Jonathan found himself learning her language, beginning to read the subtle shifts in her posture that indicated mood or intention. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Jonathan was repairing a harness on the porch when he heard something that made him freeze. Music, faint, melodic humming coming from the barn. He set down his work and crept closer, not wanting to startle her. Clara Rose was brushing Liberty, and she was definitely humming. A low, wordless melody that seemed to vibrate more in her chest than her throat. The horse stood perfectly still, ears swiveled back to catch the sound, eyes half closed in contentment. "I thought you couldn't speak," Jonathan said softly. Clara Rose spun around, dropping the brush, her face flushing with what looked like fear. She touched her throat and shook her head vigorously, backing away. "No, it's all right," Jonathan said quickly, holding up his hands. "I'm not angry. I heard you humming." She continued to shake her head, but Jonathan could see the truth in her eyes. She could make sounds. Maybe not words, maybe not easily, but she wasn't completely mute. That night, she didn't come to the house for supper. Jonathan found her in the barn, curled up in the hayloft with the cats. She wouldn't look at him, wouldn't respond to his attempts to communicate. "Clara Rose," he said finally, sitting down on a hay bale below her. "I don't care if McKenna lied. Hell, I figured he was lying about something. Man like that lies about everything. What I care about is—" He paused, searching for words. "You've got a gift. With the animals, with whatever it is you do, I've never seen anything like it." She peered down at him through the hay, wary as a wild animal. "Your secrets are yours to keep," he continued. "But you're safe here, whatever you're running from. Whoever hurt you before, they can't reach you here. You have my word on that." Slowly, Clara Rose climbed down from the loft. She stood before him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She reached out and took his hand, placing it flat against her throat. Then she tried to speak. What came out wasn't words. It was a harsh, broken sound that seemed to pain her. She tried again, her face contorting with effort, producing only a raspy whisper that he couldn't understand. "Damaged." She finally managed to sign, pointing to her throat. Not deaf. Her gestures said, not completely mute, just broken. "Who did this to you?" Jonathan asked, anger rising in his chest. But Clara Rose just shook her head and walked away, leaving him with more questions than answers. That night, he lay awake thinking about the scars he'd glimpsed on her throat, usually hidden by her high collars. Thinking about what could damage a voice but leave hearing intact. Thinking about why a father would sell a daughter who clearly had valuable skills. The next morning, Clara Rose was back at work as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted between them. She began teaching him more of her signs, and he began teaching her the mundane details of ranch management. They worked side by side, mending fences, hauling water, tending stock. And sometimes, when she thought he wasn't paying attention, Jonathan would catch her humming again, that same wordless melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. A sound that the horses loved and that made something in his own chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. The trouble started on a Sunday morning in late October, when Jonathan and Clara Rose made their monthly trip into Redemption Creek for supplies. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine over the past 2 months. She would tend to the horses while he conducted business, meeting him at the general store when he was finished. But this time, as Jonathan loaded sacks of flour and coffee into the wagon, he noticed a crowd gathering near the church. His instincts prickled with unease when he saw Clara Rose at the center of it, backed against the churchyard fence. Ain't natural. I tell you, Martha Edison, the minister's wife, was proclaiming loudly. I saw her with my own eyes, making signs in the air like some kind of witch's spell, and that lame dog of Williams just got up and walked. She touched my boy's fevered head last week, another woman added. And the fever broke within the hour. What kind of power is that for a deaf-mute girl to have? Jonathan pushed through the crowd, his presence causing a momentary hush. Clara Rose looked at him with relief, though she kept her chin high, refusing to cower before her accusers. Afternoon, folks, Jonathan said calmly, though his hand instinctively moved toward his hip where his gun would have been if he'd been wearing it. Something I can help with. Your girl there. Thomas Roosevelt, the town banker, stepped forward. People are talking. Hail. Strange things happening wherever she goes. Animals acting peculiar. Sick folks getting well too quick. It ain't Christian. Since when is healing folk unchristian? Jonathan countered. Seemed to recall someone else who was known for that. Blasphemy, Martha Edison gasped. How dare you compare this creature to our Lord? The crowd murmured angrily, pressing closer. Clara Rose moved nearer to Jonathan, and he could feel her trembling slightly, though her face remained composed. Now hold on. Dr. Alexander Hamilton, the town physician, pushed his way forward. An educated man from back east, he'd always been more reasonable than most. I've seen this young woman's work with animals. It's unusual. Yes, but hardly witchcraft. Some people simply have a gift for understanding creatures. Nothing supernatural about it. Then how do you explain her knowing things she couldn't possibly know? Demanded Benjamin Franklin Colt, the blacksmith. My wife says she knew our mare was carrying a foal before any signs showed. Knew it was twins, too. And that proved true enough. Woman's intuition. Dr. Hamilton suggested. But even he looked uncertain. The crowd was growing larger, drawing people from the saloon and nearby shops. Jonathan recognized the ugly mood. He'd seen it before, in army camps when soldiers needed someone to blame for their misfortunes. We ought to run her out of town, someone shouted from the back. Her, and anyone who harbors her. Now see here, Jonathan's voice carried the authority of his military years. This young woman has done nothing but help folks with their animals. If that's a crime in Redemption Creek, then this town's in worse shape than I thought. Help, Martha Edison scoffed. She's bewitched you. Jonathan Hale living out there alone with her. No proper chaperone. It's indecent. Clara Rose suddenly moved, stepping in front of Jonathan as if to shield him from the crowd's anger. She held up her hands in a gesture of peace, then slowly, deliberately, began to sign. Jonathan recognized some of it. She was trying to explain, to make them understand that she meant no harm. But the crowd saw only strange gestures from a strange girl, and their fear deepened. She's casting a spell, someone cried, and the mob surged forward. What happened next would be debated in Redemption Creek for years to come, just as the crowd rushed toward them. Every horse on Main Street tied to posts, hitched to wagons, standing in the livery stable, began to rear and whinny in unison. the sound was deafening, and the animal's sudden frenzy sent people scattering in all directions. In the chaos, Jonathan grabbed Clara Rose's hand and ran for their wagon. Thunder and lightning, alone among all the horses, remained calm, though their eyes showed white and their ears lay flat. Clara Rose vaulted into the wagon bed while Jonathan took the reins, and they fled Redemption Creek in a cloud of dust and accusations. They didn't speak, couldn't speak, during the wild ride home. But Jonathan was acutely aware of Clara Rose behind him, could feel her shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. When they finally reached the ranch, she jumped down before the wagon fully stopped and ran for the barn. Jonathan tended to the horses, giving her time. His mind churned over the afternoon's events. How had all the horses known to react at just that moment? It was impossible. And yet, he found Clara Rose in Liberty's stall, her face buried in the mare's mane, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When she heard him approach, she tried to compose herself, wiping her face with her sleeve. "Don't," Jonathan said softly. "You don't have to pretend with me." She looked at him then, and the raw pain in her eyes made his chest tighten. Slowly, haltingly, she began to sign, and he translated as best he could. "They're right to fear me. I am different. Cursed." "You're not cursed," Jonathan said firmly. "You have a gift." She shook her head violently, then placed her hand on Liberty's neck. The mare immediately calmed, her breathing slowing to match Clara Rose's. Then she moved to Washington, and the same thing happened. Each animal she touched seemed to sync with her, as if she were conducting some silent orchestra. "My mother had it too," she signed, her gestures becoming more frantic. "They called her witch, burned our home. She died saving me. Father blamed me, said I was devil's spawn, tried to—" She touched her throat, and Jonathan understood. Her father had tried to silence her gift permanently. "When that didn't work, he sold me," she continued. "Said better to get coin than harbor evil." The full tragedy of her story hit Jonathan like a physical blow. This young woman, gifted with an extraordinary ability to understand and heal, had been persecuted and betrayed by those who should have protected her. "Clara Rose," he said, moving closer slowly, as he would with a spooked horse. "What those people did, your father, those townsfolk, that's the evil, not you, never you." She looked at him with eyes full of doubt and hope in equal measure. "As for Redemption Creek," he continued, "they can go hang themselves. We don't need them. Everything we need is right here." But even as he said it, Jonathan knew it wouldn't be that simple. The ranch did need supplies from town, and if the townspeople's fear turned to action, his concerns proved justified 3 days later when riders appeared on the ridge above the ranch. 6 men, led by Thomas Roosevelt, sat their horses in silent threat before riding away. A warning. The next week, it was a dozen men who came closer, close enough for Jonathan to recognize faces. They didn't speak, just watched the ranch for an hour before leaving. Clara Rose grew quieter with each visit, the light dimming in her eyes. She still worked with the animals, but Jonathan caught her looking over her shoulder constantly, starting at unexpected sounds. She moved her bedding from the barn to the small storage room in the house, accepting his repeated offer of proper shelter. He knew it was because she felt safer with walls and locked doors between her and the world. The crisis came on a November night when the smell of smoke woke them both. The barn was on fire, flames already licking at the hayloft where Clara Rose had once slept. Together they fought the blaze, managing to save the animals but losing half the structure and most of the winter feed stored inside. As dawn broke over the blackened ruins, Jonathan found what he'd expected: hoof prints from multiple horses, and a message scorched into a surviving beam: "Send away the witch or burn with her." Clara Rose stood staring at the message, her face pale but resolute. When she turned to him, Jonathan already knew what she was going to sign. "I have to leave. Can't bring more trouble to you." "Like hell," Jonathan said flatly. "This is your home now. "They'll kill you," she signed desperately. "Already lost everything because of me. Can't lose you too." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither had been willing to acknowledge before. Somewhere in the past months, between shared work and quiet evenings, between her gentle healing and his steady protection, something had grown between them deeper than mere companionship. "You won't lose me," Jonathan said, his voice rough. "But I might lose myself if I let them drive you away. A man who won't stand up for what's right isn't much of a man at all." Clara Rose's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, they heard horses approaching. Lots of horses. Jonathan grabbed his rifle from the house, positioning himself between Clara Rose and the approaching riders. But as they came into view, he recognized Dr. Hamilton at the front, along with several people he hadn't expected. Miguel Cervantes, whose prize bull Clara Rose had saved from poisoning. Sarah Nightingale, whose son Clara Rose had helped through a dangerous fever. Old Joseph Beethoven, whose ancient hound walked without pain for the first time in years thanks to her treatments. "Hold your fire, Hale." "Doctor," Hamilton called out, "we come in peace." The group, about 15 in all, dismounted at a respectful distance. Jonathan kept his rifle ready but lowered it slightly. "What's this about, Doc?" "It's about right and wrong," the physician said simply. "What happened to your barn last night was wrong. Some of us have been talking, and we've decided we won't stand for it anymore." Sarah Nightingale stepped forward. "That girl saved my boy's life. I don't care if she does it by magic or medicine or miracle. She's welcome in my home any time." "She's got the gift of healing," Miguel added in his accented English. "In my country, such people are blessed, not cursed." One by one, others spoke up, telling stories of Clara Rose's kindness, her skill, the quiet help she'd given even to those who feared her. They'd come to offer protection, supplies to rebuild the barn, and most importantly, acceptance. Clara Rose listened with growing wonder, her hand finding Jonathan's and gripping it tightly. When they finished, she stepped forward and signed slowly, so all could see. "Thank you. I will help any who need it. Always." Dr. Hamilton translated for those who didn't understand, and several people wiped away tears. "There'll still be those who oppose you," the doctor warned. "Martha Edison and her lot won't give up easy, but you've got friends now. Remember that." As the group prepared to leave, promising to return with lumber and supplies, Jonathan felt something shift in the air. The battle wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, but they wouldn't face them alone. That night, as they sat on the porch looking at the stars and the smoldering ruins of the barn, Clara Rose leaned her head against Jonathan's shoulder. It was the first time she'd initiated such intimate contact, and he felt his heart skip. "We'll rebuild," he said softly, "bigger and better than before." She nodded against his shoulder, then lifted her head to look at him. In the moonlight, her eyes were luminous with unshed tears and something else, something that made his breath catch. She raised her hand to sign, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she placed her palm over his heart, feeling its rhythm. Then she took his hand and placed it over her own heart, letting him feel how it raced. They sat like that for a long moment, hearts beating in tandem, no words needed. The challenges ahead seemed less daunting with her beside him, this remarkable woman who heard the world through touch and healed with her presence. The December air bit sharp and cold as Jonathan worked alongside Miguel Cervantes and Joseph Beethoven to raise the new barn walls. For 2 weeks, supporters had come in shifts, bringing lumber, tools, and willing hands. The structure rising from the ashes was indeed bigger and better than before, a testament to the community that had formed around Clara Rose's gift. She moved among the workers like a silent blessing, bringing water, tending minor injuries, and somehow always knowing who needed a moment of rest before they asked. The horses, corralled temporarily near the house, watched the proceedings with unusual calm, as if they too understood something momentous was building. It was late afternoon when the trouble arrived. Jonathan was securing a beam when thunder's warning whinny cut through the air. On the horizon, a large group of riders approached, at least 30 men, armed and moving with purpose. "Everyone stay calm." "Doctor," Hamilton said, but his face was grave. "Keep working. Don't give them reason to claim we're an armed mob." The riders spread out in a semicircle around the property, effectively surrounding them. At their head rode Thomas Roosevelt, his banker's suit incongruous with the rifle across his saddle. Beside him, Martha Edison sat in a wagon, her face twisted with righteous fury. Jonathan Hale, Roosevelt, called out, "By the authority vested in me, as a town alderman, I order you to surrender the girl called Clara Rose to face justice for witchcraft and corruption of Christian souls." "Since when does Redemption Creek try people for witchcraft?" "Doctor," Hamilton stepped forward, "this isn't Salem, and it sure as hell isn't 1692. She's bewitched half the town." Martha Edison stood up in the wagon, pointing an accusing finger. "Turned neighbor against neighbor, brought discord to our peaceful community. The Bible says thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." "The Bible says a lot of things you don't seem to follow, Martha." Sarah Nightingale shot back, "Like love thy neighbor and judge not lest ye be judged." The tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Jonathan moved closer to Clara Rose, who stood perfectly still, her face pale but composed. He could see her hands trembling slightly, the only sign of her fear. "You want her. You'll have to go through me," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd made his decision and would live or die with it. "And me." Miguel stepped up beside him. "And me, Doctor," Hamilton added. One by one, the workers moved to form a protective circle around Clara Rose, even some who'd come just to help a neighbor, not particularly believing in her gift, stood firm against the mob mentality they saw forming. Roosevelt's face darkened. "You're harboring a dangerous element. Hale, we've got sworn testimonies, animals acting unnatural, impossible knowledge, signs and wonders that mock the Lord's natural order." "What I see," Jonathan said slowly, "is a young woman who helps sick creatures and asks nothing in return. If that's evil in your book, then your book needs rewriting." "Blasphemer," Martha Edison shrieked. "She's corrupted you all. Can't you see she's Satan's handmaiden, sent to lead you astray?" Clara Rose suddenly moved, stepping out from the protective circle before anyone could stop her. She walked forward with quiet dignity until she stood alone between the two groups, then raised her hands for attention. Slowly, deliberately, she began to sign. "Doctor," Hamilton translated, his voice carrying across the tense scene. "I mean no harm. Have never meant harm. If my presence brings danger to innocent people, I will leave. But first, let me show you something." She turned to where the horses were corralled and made a low humming sound in her throat, that same wordless melody Jonathan had heard months ago. Every horse in the corral, including those belonging to Roosevelt's men, turned to face her. Then, in perfect synchronization, they all knelt, not in submission, but almost as if in reverence. Gasps rose from both groups. Some of Roosevelt's men backed their mounts away nervously, while others stared in awe. "Witchcraft!" Martha Edison cried, but her voice wavered. Clara Rose continued signing, and "Doctor," Hamilton continued translating, "not witchcraft, understanding. The creatures of this earth speak in ways beyond words. I simply learned to listen. Your own book says the Lord gave Adam dominion over animals, but dominion through understanding, not domination through force." She walked among the kneeling horses, touching each gently, and they rose at her touch. Then she approached one of Roosevelt's men whose horse was favoring its left rear leg. "Your mount is in pain." "Doctor," Hamilton translated her signs, "a stone bruise, getting worse, if you'll permit." The man, Young William Shakespeare looked uncertainly at Roosevelt, then nodded. Clara Rose ran her hands down the horse's leg, found the spot, and worked it gently with her fingers. The horse, which had been tense and irritable, visibly relaxed. "The stone's out," she signed, and Dr. Hamilton translated. "Soak the hoof in warm salt water tonight. He'll be sound by morning." "It's a trick," Martha Edison insisted, but even her supporters looked uncertain now. Clara Rose wasn't finished. She walked back to the center and began signing again, her movements larger, more emphatic. "You fear what you don't understand. I know this fear, have lived with it all my life. But fear makes us do terrible things, makes us hurt what might help us. You burned my mother for the same gift. Will you burn me too? And then who the doctor who knows too much about healing? The woman who predicts weather by her bones, where does it end?" The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, from among Roosevelt's men, William Shakespeare dismounted and walked forward. "My horse does feel better," he said quietly. "And last month, when my daughter was sick and Doc Hamilton couldn't break her fever, I brought her to you." He looked at Clara Rose. "You sat with her all night, humming that sound, keeping your hands on her head. By morning, the fever was gone." "William," Roosevelt barked, "get back here!" But Shakespeare shook his head. "No, sir. I won't be part of hurting someone who saved my little girl." Others began to murmur, and Jonathan saw the moment when the tide began to turn. More of Roosevelt's men looked uncomfortable, some even beginning to edge away from the confrontation. It was then that Clara Rose did something that would become legend in Redemption Creek. She walked directly to Martha Edison's wagon, looking up at the woman who'd been her fiercest accuser. Martha recoiled, but Clara Rose simply stood there, waiting. Then she signed, "Your heart hurts, not your body, your spirit. You lost someone, recent, someone you loved very much." Martha's face went white. How could you?" "The grief sits heavy here." Clara Rose placed her hand over her own heart. "I know this pain. Lost my mother to fear and hatred. Don't let your loss turn you into what you hate." "My son," Martha whispered, tears starting to flow. "My James. 3 months ago, fever took him. If you can heal, why didn't you save him? Why didn't God save him?" Clara Rose's own eyes filled with tears as she signed. "Cannot heal everything? Cannot save everyone? Gift has limits. But grief shared is grief softened. Pain spoken is pain lessened." She held out her hand to Martha Edison. For a long moment, the older woman stared at it like it was a snake. Then, with a sob that seemed to come from her very soul, she took it. What happened next, witnesses would describe differently. Some said they felt a warmth spread through the crowd. Others claimed they heard a sound like wind chimes on a still day. But everyone agreed that Martha Edison climbed down from that wagon a changed woman, embracing Clara Rose like a daughter while sobbing out months of bottled grief. The confrontation dissolved like morning mist. Roosevelt, seeing his support evaporate, tried to rally his remaining men, but even they were moving away, affected by what they'd witnessed. "This isn't over. Hale," he shouted as he turned his horse. "The law will hear about this." "What law, Doctor?" Hamilton called after him. "The law against compassion, against healing good luck, finding that statute." Roosevelt. As the riders departed, leaving only dust and confusion in their wake, the building crew stood in stunned silence. Then old Joseph Beethoven cleared his throat. "Well," he said gruffly, "this barn ain't gonna build itself. Still got daylight left." The spell broke, and people returned to work, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a lightness now, a sense of having witnessed something profound. Martha Edison stayed, working alongside Sarah Nightingale, the two former enemies now united in their understanding. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Jonathan found himself alone with Clara Rose for the first time since the confrontation. They stood by the corral, watching the horses settle for the evening. "That was brave," he said, "also foolish. They could have hurt you." She turned to face him fully, and he saw something new in her eyes, a confidence that hadn't been there before. She signed slowly, making sure he understood every word. "Not brave, necessary, cannot hide forever, cannot live in fear. You taught me that." "Me?" She nodded, then signed. "You stood between me and danger? Not because you had to, because you chose to. Because you saw me not as broken thing, but as person worth protecting, worth caring for." The air between them shifted, charged with unspoken words. Clara Rose stepped closer, her hand reaching up to touch his face gently. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the gesture speaking volumes her damaged voice couldn't. "Clara Rose," he began, but she placed her fingers over his lips, silencing him. Then, with infinite care, she stood on her tiptoes and replaced her fingers with her lips. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a statement. Jonathan's answer was to pull her closer, his arms wrapping around her as if he could shield her from all the world's cruelty. When they finally parted, Clara Rose was smiling, really smiling. Not the small, careful expressions he'd grown used to, but a joy that transformed her face. She signed something rapid and complex, and though he didn't understand all of it, he caught the important parts: safe, home, together. "Together," he agreed, and kissed her again as the first stars appeared overhead. Later that evening, as the building crew prepared to leave, Dr. Hamilton pulled Jonathan aside. "What happened today will spread," he said quietly. "Roosevelt won't give up easily. Neither will others who profit from fear and division. This was a battle, not the war." "I know," Jonathan replied, watching Clara Rose help Martha Edison into her wagon, the two women communicating in signs and smiles. "But something changed today. She's not alone anymore. Neither of us are." Hamilton nodded. "That gift of hers, I've been thinking. There are places back east, schools, hospitals, where someone with her abilities would be valued, not feared, where she could learn, maybe even teach others." Jonathan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "You saying we should leave?" "I'm saying you have options. Both of you. This doesn't have to be your whole world." As the doctor rode away, Jonathan stood in the gathering darkness, torn between the life he'd built here and the possibilities that lay beyond. But then Clara Rose appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his, and he knew that whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced today, together. In the new barn, a lantern glowed warm against the night. The horses settled peacefully in their stalls, and somewhere in the rafters, a barn owl called, a wild, free sound that seemed to bless the space with its presence. Clara Rose leaned against Jonathan's shoulder, humming softly, and he thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd already found what they were looking for. The title moment had arrived in the midst of chaos, witnessed by half the town. "Sweetheart, you're stronger than a Mustang," he murmured into her hair, remembering the words he'd thought but hadn't spoken aloud during the confrontation. She couldn't hear him, but she felt the vibration of his voice, the sentiment behind it, and pressed closer in response. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be those who still feared, still hated, still sought to destroy what they didn't understand. But tonight, in their rebuilt barn surrounded by the quiet testimony of healed creatures and opened hearts, they had this moment. And for now, it was enough. The winter had been kind to them. After the confrontation at the barn raising, an uneasy peace settled over the valley. Those who supported Clara Rose grew bolder in their defense, while her detractors seemed to retreat, at least publicly. The Double H Ranch became a haven for those seeking her gift, farmers with sick livestock, mothers with ailing children, even Martha Edison, who came weekly to sit with Clara Rose and learn her signs. It was a February morning, frost still clinging to the grass. When everything changed, Jonathan woke to find Clara Rose's side of the bed empty and cold. They'd been sharing the house properly since Christmas, when he'd finally convinced her that propriety mattered less than warmth and companionship during the bitter nights. He found her in the barn, pressed against Liberty's stall, her whole body trembling. When she turned to him, her face was streaked with tears, and her hands shook too badly to sign clearly. "What is it?" Jonathan asked, alarmed. "What's wrong?" She tried to answer, but her emotions were too strong. Instead, she took his hand and placed it on her abdomen, holding it there while looking into his eyes with a mixture of wonder and terror. The realization hit him like a physical blow. A child. They were going to have a child. "Are you certain?" he asked softly, though he could see the answer in her eyes. She nodded, then finally managed to sign, 2 months, maybe more. I didn't realize. Thought it was just the worry, the stress." Jonathan pulled her into his arms, his mind racing. They weren't married, had never even discussed it, though their commitment to each other ran deeper than any ceremony could make it. In a town already suspicious of Clara Rose, this would be ammunition for their enemies. "It's going to be all right," he murmured against her hair. "We'll figure it out. Together." She pulled back to look at him, signing rapidly. "How they already call me witch, now they'll call me worse. And the baby. What if the baby has my gift? What if they—" "Stop," Jonathan said firmly, catching her hands. "No one is going to hurt you or our child. I'll die before I let that happen." The word "our" seemed to steady her. She took a deep breath, then signed more calmly. "We need to marry, soon, quietly." Jonathan nodded, already thinking logistics. Dr. Hamilton would help, surely, and perhaps Judge Abraham Lincoln in the neighboring county, who was known for his discretion and fairness. They were married 3 days later in Dr. Hamilton's study, with only Sarah Nightingale and Miguel Cervantes as witnesses. Judge Lincoln, a tall, gaunt man with kind eyes, performed the ceremony without asking questions about Clara Rose's inability to speak her vows aloud. Her signs, translated by Dr. Hamilton, carried more weight than any spoken words could have. For a few weeks, they managed to keep their secret. Clara Rose wore looser clothing and kept to the ranch more than usual, but secrets in a small community have a way of revealing themselves. It was Martha Edison, ironically, who noticed first. She'd come for her weekly visit, bringing preserves and gossip from town, when she stopped mid-sentence and stared at Clara Rose with dawning comprehension. "Child," she said softly. "You're with child." Clara Rose's hand went instinctively to her stomach, and that was answer enough. "How far along?" Martha asked, her voice gentle. 4 months. Clara Rose signed, and Martha translated for herself now, having learned enough to understand. "And you're married?" at Clara Rose's nod. Martha's face broke into a smile. "Well then, we'd best start preparing. A baby. Oh, there's so much to do." The news spread, as news does, but the reaction was more mixed than Jonathan had feared. Those who'd come to care for Clara Rose rejoiced, already planning gifts and assistance, but Roosevelt and his faction saw opportunity. Pregnant out of wedlock, married in secret. Roosevelt proclaimed at a town meeting Jonathan didn't attend but heard about from Dr. Hamilton. What more proof do we need of her corrupting influence? And what kind of child will come from such a union? We've all seen what she can do with animals. Imagine that power in a child, growing up wild on that ranch. The fear-mongering might have gained more traction, but then something extraordinary happened. Clara Rose's gift, always strong, seemed to intensify with her pregnancy. Animals from miles around began arriving at the ranch. Wild deer would graze peacefully alongside the cattle. Hawks would perch on fence posts. Even a mountain cat was seen sitting calmly by the barn one morning before padding back into the hills. More remarkably, Clara Rose's ability to sense illness or injury expanded. she would suddenly insist Jonathan check on a neighbor's farm, where they'd invariably find an animal in distress or a person in need of help. Her predictions about weather became uncannily accurate, allowing farmers to save crops from unexpected freezes or storms. "It's like she's connected to the whole valley." "Doctor," Hamilton marveled one evening, after Clara Rose had correctly diagnosed a horse's ailment from a mile away. "The pregnancy has somehow amplified her abilities." But with the gift came a cost. Clara Rose grew more sensitive to others' pain, both physical and emotional. She would wake gasping from nightmares that weren't her own, feeling the distress of creatures miles away. Jonathan would find her standing at the window in the middle of the night, tears streaming down her face as she signed, "Something hurts out there. Something needs help." It was during one of these episodes, on a March night with rain lashing the windows, that Clara Rose suddenly doubled over in pain. She was only 6 months along. Too early. Far too early. "No," she signed frantically as Jonathan supported her. "Not the baby. Something else. Fire. Death. Coming this way." Jonathan didn't question her. He'd learned to trust her instincts absolutely. He helped her to a chair, grabbed his rifle and slicker, and headed for the door. "Stay here," he commanded. "Lock the door behind me." But she was already shaking her head, struggling to stand. "Together," she signed. "Has to be together." Against his better judgment, they ventured out into the storm. Clara Rose led, following some invisible pull, until they created a rise and saw it. Roosevelt's house, 3 miles distant, ablaze despite the rain, and moving away from it, a group of riders heading directly for the Double H. They set their own house on fire. Jonathan realized with horror, "They're going to blame it on you." Clara Rose's face was grim as she signed, "More. They have someone hurt." They raced back to the ranch. Arriving just minutes before the riders, Jonathan had time to wake Miguel, who'd been staying in the barn to help with calving season, and to position themselves defensively. The riders thundered into the yard, Roosevelt at their head, his face a mask of rage and soot. But it was what they dragged behind them that made Clara Rose cry out, her first audible sound in months. Young William Shakespeare, the man who'd stood up for her at the barn raising, bound and beaten, barely conscious. "There's your witch's work," Roosevelt shouted over the storm. "My house burned, my strongbox emptied, and this traitor found nearby. She sent him to do her evil work." "That's a lie," Jonathan shouted back. "Clara Rose has been here all evening." "With what witness you?" Roosevelt sneered. "Her devoted fool of a husband. We know she can make animals do her bidding. Why not men?" Clara Rose moved before anyone could stop her, running toward William despite Jonathan's shout of warning. She dropped to her knees beside the injured man, her hands immediately going to his wounds. "Don't touch him, witch!" someone yelled. But Clara Rose ignored them, her entire focus on the beaten man. What happened next would be debated for years. Some swore they saw light emanating from Clara Rose's hands. Others claimed the rain around her turned warm, steaming as it hit the ground. But everyone agreed that William Shakespeare's breathing, ragged and wet, suddenly eased. His eyes opened, focused, and he spoke in a clear voice. "Wasn't her, saw who did it. Roosevelt. Saw Roosevelt set his own fire." The accusation hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Roosevelt's face went purple with rage. "The witch has addled his brains," he snarled. "She's making him lie." But William struggled to sit up, supported by Clara Rose. "Insurance money," he gasped. "Heard you talking to Mason. Burn the house, blame the witch, collect the money and rid the town of her at once." "Only I was riding by. Saw too much." "Liar!" Roosevelt roared, raising his rifle. Several things happened simultaneously. Jonathan moved to shield Clara Rose. Miguel raised his own weapon. And every animal on the ranch, horses, cattle, chickens, even the barn cats, began making noise at once, a cacophony that seemed to shake the very air. But it was Clara Rose who stopped everything. She stood slowly, one hand protectively over her swollen belly, and began to hum that same wordless melody Jonathan had first heard months ago, but stronger now, fuller. The sound seemed to come not just from her damaged throat, but from her whole being. The animals fell silent. The rain seemed to lessen. Even the men on horseback found themselves frozen, unable to move or speak. In that moment of unnatural calm, Clara Rose walked directly to Roosevelt. She placed her hand on his horse's neck, and the animal immediately knelt, spilling Roosevelt to the muddy ground. She stood over him, no longer the frightened girl who'd been sold at market, and began to sign. Her movements were large, deliberate, meant for all to see. Dr. Hamilton, who'd arrived with several others drawn by the commotion, translated in a voice that carried over the yard. "You fear me because you fear truth. Your heart is black with greed, your soul twisted with hatred. But I offer you a choice. Confess your crimes and leave this valley forever, or stay and face the judgment of those you've wronged. Choose." Roosevelt scrambled backward in the mud, his eyes wild. "You can't. You have no power over me." Clara Rose simply stood there, waiting, and one by one, his men dismounted and backed away from him. The truth in William's words, combined with what they'd witnessed, had broken his hold over them. I... Roosevelt looked around wildly, finding no support, no allies. Finally, his shoulders slumped. The fire was my doing, the frame-up too. I'll leave. Tonight. Just call them off. "Call who off, Doctor?" Hamilton asked. But then they heard it, a low rumble from the surrounding darkness. Eyes reflected in the lamplight, dozens of them. The wild creatures Clara Rose had befriended, drawn by her distress, surrounding the ranch. "Go." Clara Rose signed simply, "Never return." Roosevelt fled, his remaining supporters scattering with him. In the aftermath, as Dr. Hamilton tended to William's injuries and the crowd dispersed, Jonathan found Clara Rose leaning heavily against the porch rail. "The baby?" he asked urgently. She managed a weak smile and signed, strong like father, but tired now, so tired. He carried her inside, his heart still racing from the night's events. As he helped her into bed, she caught his hand and placed it on her belly. He felt movement, strong, insistent, as if the child within was making its presence known. "Our child will be special." Clara Rose signed sleepily. "Different, like me. Is that all right?" Jonathan leaned down and kissed her forehead, then her lips, then the swell where their child grew. "More than all right," he whispered against her skin. "It's perfect." As dawn broke over the valley, painting the rain-washed world in shades of gold and rose, a new understanding settled over the community. The events of the night had shown them something beyond fear or superstition. They'd witnessed power used not for harm but for truth, strength employed not for vengeance but for justice. Clara Rose slept deeply, one hand resting on her belly, the other clasped in Jonathan's. Around the ranch, the animals settled into their normal routines, the wild visitors melting back into the hills as mysteriously as they'd come. But something had fundamentally shifted in the balance of the valley, and everyone who'd been there that night knew it. In her sleep, Clara Rose smiled and hummed softly, that same haunting melody that seemed to promise both mystery and hope. Jonathan watched over her, guardian and witness to the miracle that had entered his life in the form of a damaged girl who spoke with her hands and heard with her heart. The words he'd whispered to her echoed in his mind. "Sweetheart, you're stronger than a Mustang." But now he understood the truth. She wasn't just stronger. She was something altogether more magnificent, wild and free and utterly irreplaceable. carrying within her the promise of a new generation that might bridge the gap between the world that was and the world that could be. Spring arrived with a gentleness that surprised everyone after the harsh winter. The valley burst into bloom, wildflowers carpeting the meadows, fruit trees heavy with blossoms, and the air sweet with promise. At the Double H Ranch, life had settled into a new rhythm, one centered around Clara Rose's advancing pregnancy and the steady stream of visitors who came seeking her help. The change in the community was remarkable. Where once people had whispered behind closed doors about the witch woman, they now spoke openly of the healer who'd saved their livestock, eased their pain, or simply listened with that uncanny understanding of hers. Even the children, once kept away by fearful parents, now played in the yard while their mothers consulted with Clara Rose about everything from colicky babies to failing crops. On a warm April morning, Jonathan found Clara Rose in the garden she'd planted behind the house, teaching a group of women her unique sign language. Martha Edison was there, translating for the others, her transformation from accuser to advocate complete. "She's saying that healing starts with listening," Martha explained as Clara Rose's hands moved gracefully. "Not just with your ears, but with your whole being. Feel the earth beneath you, the air around you. Everything speaks if we learn how to hear." Sarah Nightingale raised her hand. "But Clara Rose, we don't have your gift. How can we learn what you know?" Clara Rose smiled and signed her response, which Martha translated, "Not my gift alone, different gifts for different people. Sarah, you know when rain comes by your bones. Marie Curie there knows which herbs grow where without looking. Elizabeth Blackwell can tell if a cow will birth easy or hard. All gifts, all valuable." Jonathan watched from the porch, marveling at the scene. His wife, he still felt a thrill thinking the word had created something unprecedented, a community of women learning from each other, supporting each other, in defiance of all convention. Dr. Hamilton appeared at his elbow, medical bag in hand. "Remarkable, isn't she?" the doctor said quietly. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I've learned more about healing in these past months than in all my formal education." "She has that effect," Jonathan agreed. "Makes you see the world different?" "Speaking of which," Hamilton's tone grew serious, "I need to examine her. She's close now, and with her unique constitution." Jonathan felt the familiar flutter of anxiety. The baby wasn't due for another month, but Clara Rose had been experiencing what she called echoes, moments where she seemed to feel the baby's consciousness separately from her own. Just yesterday, she'd gasped and signed frantically, "The baby sees through my eyes, but different, sees the connections, the threads between all living things." They approached the group, and Clara Rose looked up with that radiant smile that pregnancy had brought to her face. But as she started to stand, her expression suddenly changed. Her hands went to her belly, and she doubled over with a gasp that was part pain, part surprise. The women immediately surrounded her, years of birthing experience among them, but it was Clara Rose who signed urgently to Martha, "Not yet, baby, not ready. Something else, something coming." Before anyone could ask what she meant, they heard it, thunder in the distance. Though the sky was clear, no, not thunder. Hoofbeats, many hoofbeats. "Everyone inside," Jonathan ordered, his hand going to the rifle propped by the door. But Clara Rose caught his arm, shaking her head. "Not danger," she signed quickly. "Desperate? Need help? Many hurt?" The riders came into view, a full cavalry unit by the look of them, though their uniforms were dust-covered and torn. At their head rode a young lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 25. But it was the wagon train behind them that told the real story. Covered wagons filled with wounded soldiers and what looked like civilian families. The lieutenant dismounted, swaying with exhaustion. "Please," he said. "We need help. Apache raid 3 days ago. We've been riding hard, but the wounded—" "Doctor said there was a healer here. Someone who could help when medicine couldn't." Doctor, Hamilton stepped forward. I'm a doctor. How many wounded? 15 soldiers, 8 civilians, 3 of them children. The lieutenant's voice cracked on the last word. We've lost 6 already. Can't lose more. Clara Rose was already moving, her pregnancy seemingly forgotten as she organized with quick gestures. Women scattered to prepare food, water, bandages. The barn was cleared to accommodate the wounded. Within minutes, the ranch transformed into a field hospital. What followed was a testament to everything Clara Rose had built. The women worked alongside Dr. Hamilton, following Clara Rose's signed directions as she moved among the wounded with that uncanny ability to know who needed help most urgently. She couldn't speak to comfort them, but her touch seemed to ease pain in ways the doctor's medicines couldn't match. One soldier, barely more than a boy, had a fever that wouldn't break. Doctor, Hamilton had done all he could, but the young man was slipping away. Clara Rose knelt beside him, placing her hands on his burning forehead, and began to hum. That same melody, but with variations now. Rises and falls that seemed to match the patient's labored breathing. What's she doing? The lieutenant asked Jonathan. Honestly, I don't know. Jonathan replied, but I've seen her save lives the doc had given up on. Trust her. As the afternoon wore on, the crisis deepened. More soldiers developed fever. One of the children, a girl of no more than 6, cried inconsolably for her mother who'd been lost in the raid. Clara Rose worked tirelessly, despite Jonathan's growing concern for her condition. It was near sunset when it happened. Clara Rose was sitting with a fevered soldier, maintaining her strange humming vigil, when suddenly she cried out, a sound of pure pain that everyone heard. She clutched her belly, and when she looked up at Jonathan, her eyes were wide with fear. The baby, she signed frantically. Coming now, too soon. Can't stop it. Dr. Hamilton was there in an instant, but his face was grim. She's right. Labor's started. We need to get her inside immediately. No, Clara Rose signed emphatically. Can't leave them. The soldier, the children, they need... Another contraction hit, stronger than the first, and she couldn't finish. But her eyes pleaded with Jonathan to understand. It was Martha Edison who solved the dilemma. We'll bring them to her, she declared. The worst cases, if she must labor, let it be while doing what she's called to do. And so, in a scene that defied all convention, Clara Rose labored to bring new life into the world while fighting to save others. The fevered soldier was carried in and placed on a cot near her bed. The crying child was brought to sit beside her. As her own pain intensified, she continued to hum, to touch, to heal. This is madness. Doctor, Hamilton muttered, but even he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The soldier's fever began to break. The child's cries softened to whimpers, then to sleep. Hours passed in a blur of pain and purpose. Clara Rose's humming grew stronger even as her body weakened, the sound filling the room with an almost palpable energy. The women took turns supporting her, translating her signs when she could manage them, being her voice when she needed one. She says the baby is special, Martha relayed during a brief respite between contractions. Says it's been helping her, lending its strength to heal others. As midnight approached, the moment arrived. Clara Rose's final push coincided with a sound unlike anything anyone had heard. Her hum rose to an actual note, clear and pure despite her damaged throat. It rang through the room like a bell, and in that moment, several things happened at once. The soldier's eyes opened, clear and focused for the first time in days. The child sat up, calling Mama in a wondering voice, and into this world of pain and healing, of death and life, Clara Rose and Jonathan's daughter was born. She was small but perfect, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. She didn't cry. Instead, she made a sound that was almost like an echo of her mother's hum. A girl. Doctor, Hamilton announced, his voice thick with emotion. Healthy, Despite being early, it's a miracle." Clara rose, exhausted beyond measure, managed to sign one question the others. "Alive," Jonathan told her, tears streaming down his face. "All alive. You saved them all." She smiled then, a radiant expression of joy and relief, before accepting her daughter into her arms. The baby looked up at her mother with those knowing eyes, and Clara Rose gasped softly. "She hears like me," she signed weakly. "Feels the connections, but more. She can speak. She will speak for those who cannot." As dawn broke over the Double H Ranch, painting the world in soft pastels, a profound peace settled over the makeshift hospital. Soldiers who'd been dying were sitting up, taking water. The little girl who'd lost her mother was curled up asleep beside Clara Rose's bed, one small hand touching the blanket that wrapped the baby. The lieutenant, who'd watched the whole impossible night unfold, approached Jonathan with something like awe in his eyes. "I've seen battlefield miracles," he said quietly. "But this, your wife, sir, she's something beyond my understanding. That baby was born to healing the way some are born to music or art." Over the following days, as the soldiers recovered and prepared to continue their journey, word spread of the miracle at the Double H, but it wasn't fear or suspicion that spread this time. It was hope. People began to understand that Clara Rose's gift, far from being something to fear, was a treasure to be protected and cherished. The baby, whom they named Hope at Clara Rose's insistence, grew stronger each day. She rarely cried, seeming to understand the world around her in ways that should have been impossible for a newborn. When she was upset, Clara Rose would hum to her, and Hope would hum back, two voices creating a harmony that made everyone who heard it stop and listen. "She's your daughter." "Sure enough," Martha Edison said one afternoon, watching Hope calm a fractious cat with her tiny presence. "But she's also something new, a bridge, maybe, between your world and ours." Clara rose, holding her daughter while watching the last of the soldiers prepare to leave, signed her agreement. "New world coming," she said through Martha's translation. "Old fears dying, hope for tomorrow." And as the cavalry unit rode away, their lieutenant turned back for one last salute to the woman who'd saved his men while bringing forth new life. In years to come, he would tell the story in far-off places, and always end it the same way I saw the future being born that night, and her name was Hope. 5 years had passed since Hope's miraculous birth, and the Double H Ranch had become something neither Jonathan nor Clara Rose could have imagined. It was no longer just a cattle ranch, but a center of healing and learning, where people came from hundreds of miles to seek help and wisdom. Hope herself was a wonder. At 5 years old, she possessed her mother's gift, but magnified. She could not only sense the pain and needs of living creatures, but could communicate with them in ways that astounded everyone. Unlike her mother, Hope could speak clearly, her voice carrying that same musical quality as Clara Rose's hum. On this particular autumn morning, Jonathan found his daughter sitting in the pasture, surrounded by a mixed congregation of wild and domestic animals. A hawk perched on her shoulder, rabbits dozed at her feet, and Liberty's newest foal stood guard beside her. Hope was speaking to them in her lilting voice, telling them a story about stars and sky. "Morning, little Mustang," Jonathan said, using the pet name he'd given her. "Your mama's looking for you. Breakfast is ready." Hope looked up at him with eyes that were her mother's brown, but flecked with gold like autumn leaves. "Papa, the animals say a storm is coming. Not rain, a people storm. They're frightened." Jonathan's smile faded. Hope's predictions were never wrong. "How long?" "Soon," Hope said solemnly, "before the sun is high." He scooped her up, the animals scattering peacefully, and carried her toward the house. Clara Rose was on the porch, teaching her morning class. What had started as a few women learning signs had grown into a proper school, where children and adults alike came to learn not just communication, but the healing arts Clara Rose had developed. When Clara Rose saw them, Her face lit up with that smile that still made Jonathan's heart skip. She signed quickly. Hope wandering again. Delivering messages. Jonathan replied. She says trouble's coming. Clara Rose's expression grew serious. She'd learned to trust their daughter's gift as completely as Jonathan had learned to trust hers. She dismissed the class early, and together they prepared for whatever was approaching. They didn't have long to wait. Just before noon, a grand carriage appeared on the road, followed by several riders. It was an unusual sight. Too fine for these parts, too official looking for a social call. The carriage door opened, and out stepped a man Jonathan recognized from newspaper illustrations, Governor Samuel Houston himself, along with what appeared to be government officials and, surprisingly, Dr. Hamilton. So, Mr. and Mrs. Hale, the governor said, removing his hat. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but the matter is of some urgency. Clara Rose signed a welcome, which Hope translated in her clear voice, a routine they'd developed naturally over the years. My mama says you're welcome here. Governor, would you like some water? The road is dusty. The governor's eyebrows rose. The child speaks for her mother. Among other things. Doctor, Hamilton said with a slight smile. Governor Houston, if I may make proper introductions, Jonathan Hale, his wife Clara Rose, and their daughter Hope. After the formalities and refreshments were arranged, the governor got to business. I'll be direct. Word of your wife's abilities has reached far beyond Texas, Mr. Hale. We've had inquiries from universities, medical institutions, even from Washington. There's a proposal to establish a new kind of institution, a place where gifts like your wife's can be studied, understood, and taught. Jonathan felt Clara Rose tense beside him. They'd had offers before, requests to travel, to demonstrate, to be studied. They'd refused them all. We're not interested in being curiosities, Jonathan said firmly. Nor would we ask you to be, the governor replied. What we're proposing is different. The institution would be built here, on land adjoining yours. Your wife would lead it, teaching others with similar gifts. We've already identified 7 individuals across the state with various abilities. Healing touches, weather prediction, what some call animal whispering. Clara Rose was signing rapidly now, and Hope translated, Mama asks what you really want. There's always a price. Governor Houston smiled slightly. Perceptive. Yes, there are those who fear what they don't understand. By bringing these gifts into the open, studying them scientifically, teaching them systematically, we hope to transform fear into acceptance. Your wife has already begun this work. We're offering resources to expand it. And if we refuse, Jonathan asked, then you continue as you are, the governor said simply. But I should mention, there are still those who would see people like your wife as threats. Official recognition and protection might not be unwelcome. Before anyone could respond, Hope suddenly stood up, her small face serious. Something's wrong, she announced. The animals are upset. Someone's coming who means harm. The adults exchanged glances, but they'd learned not to dismiss Hope's warnings. Sure enough, within minutes, they heard approaching horses, many of them, riding hard. Governor, one of his men said urgently, we should leave. That sounds like... He was cut off as riders crested the hill, at least 40 men, led by someone Jonathan hadn't seen in 5 years, Thomas Roosevelt. Older, harder, and accompanied by what looked like hired guns. Well, well, Roosevelt called out. The governor himself, come to visit our local witch. How fitting. Mr. Roosevelt, Governor Houston said coolly. I'd heard you'd left the state. I did, but I've returned with friends. Friends who share my concerns about the corruption spreading from this place. Roosevelt's eyes fixed on Clara Rose with undisguised hatred. 5 years I've waited. 5 years I've gathered support. There are more of us than you think. Governor, People who won't stand for this abomination." The men with Roosevelt spread out, hands on weapons. The governor's guards moved to protective positions. The air crackled with tension. It was Hope who broke the standoff. The 5-year-old walked forward, despite Jonathan's attempt to stop her, and stood in the space between the two groups. "Mr. Roosevelt," she said in her clear, carrying voice. "You're in pain. You've been in pain since your son died. My mama could have helped him, but you were too proud to ask." Roosevelt's face went white. "How dare you?" "She knows because I know," Hope continued. "The pain sits in your chest like a stone. It makes you angry at everyone who still has what you lost. But hurting us won't bring him back." "Shut that child up," Roosevelt snarled. But his men looked uncertain. There was something about Hope, a presence that made hardened gunmen hesitate. Clara Rose moved then, walking to stand beside her daughter. She began to sign, and Hope translated. "I remember your son, James. He came to me once, secretly, asked if I could help his father's heart, not his body heart, his feeling heart. He loved you very much." "Stop," Roosevelt said, but his voice cracked. "He said you were a good man before grief changed you. Said you used to laugh, used to play music. He wanted that father back." Roosevelt dismounted, stumbling slightly. You spoke with James." Clara Rose nodded, signing more. Hope translated, 3 days before the fever took him. He was already sick but hiding it. Didn't want to worry you. By the time you brought him to Dr. Hamilton, it was too late, but his last thoughts were of you, of hoping you'd find peace." The gun in Roosevelt's hand dropped to the ground. The man who'd terrorized them for years fell to his knees, sobbing like a child. His men shifted uncomfortably, unsure what to do. Governor Houston stepped forward. "Mr. Roosevelt, you have a choice. Continue this path of hatred, and I'll see you arrested for attempted assault on a state-recognized institution, or accept what's being offered here, not just forgiveness, but understanding, healing, even." Through his tears, Roosevelt looked up at Clara Rose. Can you really hear them, the dead?" Clara Rose shook her head, then signed something complex. Hope translated carefully, "Not the dead, but the love they leave behind. It stays in the world, in the people they touched. James's love for you is still here. It always was. You just couldn't feel it through the anger." What happened next became legend in Texas history. Roosevelt, broken by grief and revelation, accepted Clara Rose's outstretched hand. The touch seemed to release something in him, years of rage and pain flowing out like poison from a wound. His men, seeing their leader transformed, lowered their weapons. "I believe," Governor Houston said quietly, "we've just witnessed why this institution is necessary." The school, they would call it the Haven Institute, was established within the year. The main building stood on the hill overlooking both the Double H Ranch and the valley beyond. People came from across the country to learn, to heal, to understand. Clara Rose, with hope as her voice, taught not just the practical aspects of her gift but the philosophy behind it, that all life was connected, that healing meant listening, that fear was just love turned inside out. On a spring morning, 2 years later, Jonathan stood on their porch watching the sunrise. The ranch was bustling with activity students arriving for classes, patients seeking help, researchers documenting what they were learning. Hope, now 7, was in the pasture teaching a group of children how to listen to horses. Clara Rose joined him, slipping her hand into his. She'd never fully regained her voice, but she could manage whispers now. And sometimes, when deeply moved, a few clear words. "Happy?" Jonathan asked. She nodded, then signed. "Never imagined this. When Father sold me, thought life was over. Instead, it began." "You hear me now?" she whispered aloud, the words she'd said years ago taking on new meaning. "Always," Jonathan replied, pulling her close, always, as they watched their daughter lead the other children in a song that made the horses dance. Jonathan reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a dusty livestock market to this moment of peace and purpose. It had been a winding trail full of storms and struggles. "You know what you are," he murmured into Clara Rose's hair. "Stronger than a Mustang, wilder than the west wind, and absolutely perfect." Clara Rose turned in his arms, and for the first time in 7 years, spoke a complete sentence in a voice cracked but clear. "You saved me first." Hope's laughter carried across the morning air, joined by the neighing of horses and the voices of children learning that different didn't mean dangerous, that gifts came in many forms, and that love, true love, could overcome any obstacle. The Double H Ranch stood as a testament to that truth, its gates open to all who came seeking help, understanding, or simply a place where being different was not just accepted, but celebrated. And at its heart were 3 people who'd found each other against all odds: a lonely cowboy, a silenced girl, and their daughter who spoke for those who couldn't speak for themselves. In the distance, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, another soul seeking what they offered. Clara Rose squeezed Jonathan's hand, and together they went to welcome the stranger home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Please share in the comments below where you're listening to this tale of love, acceptance, and the triumph of the human spirit. Your thoughts and reflections on Clara Rose and Jonathan's journey mean the world to me. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a thumbs up and hit that hype button to help more listeners discover these tales of the Old West. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward the horizon.